The water came in the night, and by morning everything Elias Cobb had built in 31 years was either gone or drowning. He stood at the edge of what used to be his north field at 5:30 in the morning, the sky still a bruised purple at its edges. His boots already soaked through at the ankles. The creek had jumped its banks sometime around 2 in the morning. He had heard it, a low sustained roar that pulled him from sleep and sent him running in the dark flashlight beam, cutting through the rain. And by the time he reached the fence line had ceased to exist. The water had taken the posts. It had taken the first 50 yards of young corn, the plants he had put in 3 weeks back, in soil he had amended with lime and spent the better. Part of a Saturday working into the rows. It had pushed a wall of debris, broken branches and topsoils and his neighbour's collapsed chicken coop against the east side of his equipment shed and bent the sheet metal door off its lower hinges. His irrigation pump, which he had repaired twice in the last year, and which he could not afford to replace, sat in 8 inches of standing water. The tractor had been in the barn, and the barn had held, but the fuel tank at the barn's north corner had split along its weld seam, and 60 gallons of diesel had gone with the current. He did not do the accounting out loud. He stood in the grey light and let the scope of it land on him without flinching, the way a man does when he has learned that flinching does not help. He was 54 years old, and this farm had been in his family since his grandfather cleared the first tree from this acreage in 1962. He was not going to lose it to a storm. What he did not know yet was that 12 miles away in the town of Calverton, a phone was lighting up on a kitchen table. Elias had farmed this land alone for the past 6 years. His wife Doris had passed in the winter of the year his son Marcus left for a job in Atlanta, and the two losses, though separated by 14 months, had braided themselves together in his mind into a single season of diminishment. He still cooked for 2 out of habit, still put 2 cups in the cabinet each morning before catching himself. The farm was 540 acres, most of it row crop, some of it pasture where he ran 40 head of cattle. He had 12 acres of sweet potato and 8 of watermelon that he sold to a produce distributor out of Raleigh, and the sweet potato money was the margin that kept the operating loan manageable. The sweet potato field sat on the lowest ground of the property. The lowest ground was where the water had gone first. He knew this before he even walked down to check. He walked down anyway, because a man has to know the full weight of what he is carrying. The sweet potato field was underwater. Not flooded in the ordinary sense of standing puddles and saturated soil, the kind of flooding that drains in a day and leaves the plants stressed but alive. This was submersion, 1.5 feet of moving, silted water covering every row, the irrigation tape he had run in March floating on the surface in loose loops. He stood at the field's edge and watched a plastic seed tray he had left near the south corner drift slowly east towards the tree line. He was standing there when the sun began to come up properly, and the light on the water was, in spite of everything, beautiful. He did not feel beautiful. He felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a losing position for a long time and has just been shown the next row of fortifications he will have to build. The operating loan was $340,000. The sweet potato crop, even in a good year, returned roughly $48,000 after his costs. Without it, the math of the year fell apart in ways that would take him a long time to calculate and a longer time to solve. He pulled out his phone and looked at it, then put it back in his jacket pocket. There was no one he wanted to call at this hour with this news. His son, Marcus, called on Sundays. His brother Vern lived in Charlotte and worked a city job and would not understand the granularity of what had happened here. His nearest neighbour, Earl Tisdale, was 81 years old and had water trouble of his own to deal with this morning. Elias walked back to the house, took off his soaked boots at the back door, and sat down at the kitchen table in his wet socks. He put his hands flat on the table. He stayed like that for a while. At 6:47 that morning, his phone rang. The name on the screen was Rosie Greer, which surprised him because Rosie ran the diner in Calverton and had no particular reason to be calling him at this hour, or really at any hour. He and Doris used to eat at her diner on Sunday mornings. After Doris passed, he had gone twice more and then stopped, because sitting in the booth where they always sat together was a specific kind of pain he had not figured out how to manage. He answered the phone. She said she had heard about the flooding out on County Road 7. She said Earl Tisdale had called his daughter Pearl, and Pearl had called her daughter Nadia, who worked the Thursday morning shift at Rosie's, and the word had gotten to Rosie before 6. She asked him what the situation was. He told her, in the flat inventory tone he used when he was trying not to feel a thing he was feeling, about the corn, the pump, the fuel tank, the equipment shed, and the sweet potato field. There was a silence on the other end of the line when he finished. Then Rosie Greer said she would be there at 7:30. He said there was no need for that. She said she was not asking. He did not know, when he hung up the phone, that the word had already been moving through Calverton for an hour. Nadia had called her cousin Dre, who coached youth football on Saturday mornings and had a truck and a trailer and the capacity to organize people quickly. Dre had called his friend Caleb, who ran a landscaping crew out of town and had a loader attachment for his Kubota tractor that could move debris. Caleb had called his wife Tamara, who organized the mutual aid network at their church, and Tamara had started a phone tree that would eventually reach 47 people before the morning was over. Not all of them would come, but enough of them would come that it would change the shape of the day. Elias had known these people his whole life in the way that a man knows a town by face and name and rough biography, by the places their lives had intersected over 54 years in the same county. He knew Rosie's diner. He knew Earl Tisdale's land. He knew Dre's father, who had played on the same church basketball team as his brother Vern in 1987. He had bought watermelons at Caleb's grandfather's roadside stand as a boy. The web of connection was real and dense and very old, the way the connections of a small southern county always are. He had not thought to call any of them this morning. This was the thing he carried about himself that Doris had always argued with, his conviction that his problems were problems and his alone, and that asking for help was a form of debt he did not know how to repay. He went outside and started doing what he could do alone. He pulled the fuel tank away from the barn wall with a chain and the tractor, dragged it to higher ground, looked at the split weld seam, and understood it was a job for a welder and not for him. He propped the bent shed door back against its frame to keep the wind from catching it. He took inventory of the pump damage, which was worse than he had first thought. The motor casing cracked along one side, water in the housing. He carried it to the barn and set it on the workbench. He walked the field perimeter again, counting what could be salvaged and what could not. He was in the middle of this second walk when he heard the first truck turn off the county road. It was not one truck. It was 4 trucks, arriving in a loose convoy, their headlights still on in the grey morning. Dre's pickup with the trailer. Caleb's landscaping truck with the Kubota in the bed. A flatbed driven by a man named Henry, who worked at the co-op and whom Elias recognized by his hat. And Rosie's own Silverado, which she drove herself, the back seat loaded with 2 large steel thermoses of coffee, a box of biscuits wrapped in foil, and a set of rubber overalls she had called ahead to borrow from a due because she intended to work and had nothing farm-appropriate to wear. Elias stood in the driveway and watched them park. He did not know what to say. He said nothing. Rosie climbed out of her truck and handed him a cup of coffee and looked at him in the way she had of seeing past whatever expression a person was wearing, and she asked him to show them what needed doing first. By 7:50 that morning, there were 14 people on his property. By 9, there were 22. They arrived in stages, a woman named Linda from the hardware store who brought a case of sump pumps and handed them a truck bed still in their boxes. 2 men from the volunteer fire department who came in personal vehicles on their day off, carrying shovels and a gas-powered water pump on a hand truck. A retired county extension agent named Howard who walked the sweet potato field with Elias for 40 minutes, stepping carefully through the receding water in rubber waders, taking the measure of what was lost and what might yet be saved, talking in the specific quiet language of soil and drainage and crop stress. Howard had worked with Elias's father, had known this land for 30 years, and the way he looked at the field was the way a man looks at something he helped build. The morning unfolded the way work unfolds when people arrive knowing what they came to do. Dre organized the debris removal with the efficiency of a man accustomed to running teams, directing the loader to the worst concentrations of material against the equipment shed, flagging where the fence line needed to be rerun, moving between tasks with a quick walk and a clipboard he had brought from his truck. Caleb ran the Kubota himself. Bucket after bucket of flood debris going into a staging pile near the tree line where it would later be burned or hauled. The sump pumps went into the lowest sections of the sweet potato field, 3 of them running at once. Their discharge hoses snaked toward the drainage ditch at the field's east margin. The sound of them running was the sound of water being moved, which was the sound of something being done. Elias worked alongside all of them. He was not a man who could stand back and watch others labor on his land, and nobody expected him to. He took a shovel and worked the east ditch with 2 men from the fire department, deepening the channel so the pump discharge had somewhere to go. His back hurt in the way it always hurts after a wet, cold night and a morning of heavy work. The familiar grinding complaint of a spine that had been asked too much of for 3 decades, but he did not stop. The coffee Rosie kept in the thermos was hot and strong, and she refilled his cup twice without being asked. And at 9:30 she set up a folding table by the barn, and put the biscuits out and called everyone over, and they stood around the table in their muddy boots and ate and talked in the plain-spokenty of people who had just been doing something real, together. It was at this table, eating a biscuit he hadn't thought to buy for himself in months, that Elias began to understand the scale of what had shown up for him. Not just the labor, though the labor was real and already visible in the cleared perimeter of the shed and the draining field and the repacked gate posts. What he began to understand was the decision each of these people had made before the sun was up, the choice to get out of a warm bed on a Wednesday morning and drive to a flooded farm to help a man who had not asked. His neighbor Janice, who had 3 children under 10 and whose husband worked the overnight shift, had found someone to watch the kids and come anyway. The Reverend Thomas from the AME Church had come in his good boots because those were the only waterproof boots he owned, and he worked in them all morning without complaint. Earl Tisdale's granddaughter Keely, who was 19 and home from her first year of college, had shown up with a pair of work gloves, still in the packaging and the serious face of a person who had decided to be useful. These were not Elias's people in any formal sense. They were simply his town. He thought about Doris. She would not have been surprised by this. She had always moved through Calverton like a woman who understood the architecture of mutual trust, attending every funeral and every fundraiser and every school event, bringing food when people were sick, remembering the names of children and their grade levels and their particular small concerns. He had teased her about it once, called it her social ledger, and she had looked at him with the patient amusement of a woman who knows something her husband has not yet learned. She had said, "You don't keep a ledger for things like this. You just do them. The ledger keeps itself." He had carried that line for 6 years without fully understanding it. He thought he was beginning to understand it now, standing in the mud with biscuit in hand, while Dre walked back toward the field with 2 other men, pointing at the next thing that needed doing. Howard, the extension agent, found him after lunch. The 2 of them walked the fields again, the water now 6 inches lower from the pump work, the plant tops beginning to show in the less submerged rows. Howard said the plants that had been under more than 18 hours would show stress. Within 3 days, the leaves yellowing, the vines wilting back from the tips. Some of those plants would die, some would not. The ground would need to be assessed once it dried enough to walk without sinking, and the rows would need to be rebuilt where the flow had carved channels through the hilled soil. Howard said he thought 60% of the crop could still be brought to harvest if they managed the drainage correctly and got the rows rebuilt within the next 2 weeks. He said he knew a young man ran a bed-forming attachment and could be contracted by the day. He said he would make the call himself if Elias wanted. Elias said he wanted. The pump ran for 11 hours. By 4 in the afternoon, the sweet potato field had drained to surface saturation, the soil wet through but no longer submerged. The plant tops visible in their rows. The east fence line had been rerun for 200 yards, with posts Dre had hauled over from the co-op on the trailer, the wire stretched and stapled while Elias held the tension. The shed door had been removed by a man named George who worked on farm equipment and carried a full tool roll in his truck. And George had looked at the hinges and the frame and said he could weld a new strap bracket the following morning if Elias had a 2-inch strap section in his shop. Elias had the strap section. George said he would be back at 8. The fuel tank sat on higher ground with the cracked seam marked with chalk, waiting for a welder, and Howard had already given Elias the name and number of a man in the next county who welded agricultural equipment and charged fair prices. At 4:30, the last of the trucks left. Elias stood in the driveway and shook hands and said, "Thank you," which were the most inadequate 2 words he had ever spoken in his life. And every person received those words with a simple nod or a shoulder pat or the particular kind of smile that means "I know," and went on to their vehicle. Rosie Greer was the last to go. She folded her table and put her thermoses in her truck bed, and she turned to him before getting in the cab and she said, "Doris used to bring soup every time we'd had a hard-to-winner. I've been owing her for years." He was quiet for a moment. He said she would have loved today. Rosie smiled and said she thought so too. He walked the property after they left, in the long gold light of late afternoon, the way he always walked it at day's end. The work was not finished. It was not close to finished. The pump motor was still cracked, still sitting on his workbench. And he would spend part of the next day on the phone with the equipment supply. House in Raleigh trying to price a replacement impeller versus a full unit. The operating loan would still come due in November, and the sweet potato loss, even at Howard's optimistic estimate of 60% crop survival, would cut into his margin in ways that would require a conversation with the bank. The corn he had lost in the Northfield was gone and would have to be replanted late, which meant lower yield and later harvest, which meant adjustments he had not yet made. There was real hard work ahead of him, the kind that did not end in a single day. He walked the east fence line, running his hand along the new wire, feeling the proper tension in it. He walked to the south end of the sweet potato field and looked down the rows at the plants standing up from the wet soil, still alive, still green at their crowns. The sump pump sat at the field's edge, its discharge hose running to the drainage ditch, in its quiet mechanical work. The light on the field at this hour was the same low gold it always was. The particular colour of late afternoon in this part of the Carolina Piedmont in the last days of May, the light that had been falling this land since his grandfather's first crop, since his father's first crop, since his own. He thought about 22 people showing up before they had been asked. He thought about Dre's clipboard and the efficiency with which work had been organised that morning, and he thought about how that efficiency was itself a form of love, the serious practical kind, the kind that shows up with the right equipment and stays until the problem is smaller. He thought about George offering to come back with his welder, and Howard making the call about the bed former, and Linda from the hardware store pulling sump pumps out of her truck bed and not once mentioning what they cost. He thought about Rosie and the soup Doris used to bring. He had been carrying the farm alone for 6 years, out of something he had always called self-reliance, and that he was now beginning to understand. Might have had another name. Not strength, exactly. More like a refusal to let anyone all the way in, to let anyone see the full weight of the thing. Doris had known the weight. She had known every acre and every loan and every bad year, and she had never once looked at it the way he feared people would look at it, as failure, as inadequacy, as proof of something lacking. She had looked at it as life, as the specific shape of the life they had chosen together, worthy of the choosing. He had not let anyone else look at it that way since she was gone. He had kept his trouble to himself because trouble felt like exposure, and exposure felt like risk. What he had watched today was 22 people look at his trouble and not flinch from it, not treat it as evidence of anything other than a hard night and a man who needed a hand. He went back to the house. He took off his boots at the door, put them on the boot mat Doris had put there, the rubber mat with the faded sunflower pattern he had never replaced. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the darkening field. The pump was still running. He could hear it from here, a faint mechanical hum at the edge of the quiet. He made himself dinner, a proper dinner, the first one he had sat down to in several days, and he ate it at the kitchen table. He called Marcus in Atlanta after the dishes were done. He told him about the flood. He told him about the morning. Marcus was quiet through most of it, the particular attentive quiet of a son hearing something about his father he has not heard before. When Elias was done, Marcus said he wished he had called. Elias said he was 3 states away and couldn't have been there by 7:30. Marcus said he understood, but that he wanted to be someone his father called. Elias sat with that for a moment. He said Marcus was that person, and that he was calling him now. They talked for almost an hour. Marcus said he would come down the following weekend. He said he could take time from the job, that the job would wait. Elias said he didn't need to do that. Marcus said he wanted to, and the word wanted landed differently than needed would have, softer and more honest. They agreed on the weekend. When Elias hung up, the kitchen was dark except for the light over the stove, and the pump was still running its quiet hum out in the field. 3 weeks later, the rows had been rebuilt by the bedformer. The drainage ditch had been cleared and deepened by Caleb's crew as a favour. And the sweet potato plants, the 60% that Howard had believed would hold, had come back with a green, stubborn vigour that Elias recognised as the particular resilience of a plant that has been stressed and survived. The fuel tank had been welded. The pump motor had been replaced with a reconditioned unit Elias had found through a dealer in Greensboro, and George had installed the new strap bracket on the shed door and refused payment twice before accepting the 4 dozen eggs Elias brought him from the hen house. The corn in the north field had been replanted late, and it would come in later than he wanted, and the yield would be off, and he had already called the bank and had the honest conversation, and the loan officer had listened and extended the payment timeline by 90 days, without Elias having to ask twice. Marcus came for the weekend as he had said he would. He worked 2 full days alongside his father without complaint, learning to use the bedformer attachment on the second day, running it down the sweet potato rows with a concentration that made Elias remember him at 12, fixing something in the machine shed with the same focused seriousness. On Sunday afternoon, they walked the whole property together. All 540 acres in the long circuit that Elias had walked every Sunday since he was old enough to follow his father around. Marcus asked questions about about the soil and the drainage, and the way the creek behaved in a heavy rain, and Elias answered them, and it felt like something was being passed between them that had been waiting a long time to move. On the morning that Marcus drove back to Atlanta, Elias walked out to the sweet potato field in the early light. The plants were knee-high, healthy, the dark green of a crop that had decided to live. He stood at the end of a row and looked down its length to the tree line at the far side of the field, and he thought about the morning the water had been standing here, and 22 people coming with shovels before the sun rose, and his wife's voice in his memory, saying that the ledger keeps itself. He understood it fully now, the whole shape of what she had meant. A community is a ledger that nobody holds, a long-running account of small mercies and honest labour, and the willingness to show up before you are asked, and the balance in that account is not money and cannot be tallied, but it is real. And it is what makes it possible to survive the nights when the creek jumps its banks and takes the fence posts with it. It is what makes it possible to keep farming the land your grandfather cleared, to keep putting in the rows and tending them, and believing the harvest will come. He put his hand on the warm earth at the base of the nearest plant, pressed his palm to it, felt the moisture still in it from the irrigation the night before. The sun was clearing the tree line. The field was green and quiet and alive. If you have someone in your life who showed up for you before you thought to ask, carry that with you. This story is for them. The boots Doris had given him for his 48th birthday were on his feet, worn at the sole now, the leather darkened with 6 seasons of field work and 1 season of floodwater. He would rezole them this fall. He was not ready to replace them yet. He walked back to the house in no particular hurry, the way a man walks when he has nowhere to be for a few minutes except exactly where he is. The morning air was cool still, the kind of cool that burns off by 9 and leaves the afternoon hot and heavy, but at this hour it carried the clean smell of soil and green things growing, the specific smell of this particular piece of ground that he had known his entire life, and that he sometimes thought he could identify blindfolded from among any number of fields, the way some people can identify a piece of music from its first 4 notes. He had grown up running barefoot across this land, had learned to drive on the tractor road that ran along the tree line, had proposed to Doris on the slope of the north pasture on a September evening when the light was low and the cattle were quiet. Every acre had its memory. The flooded sections had their memories too, the memory of the water and the people who came, which was already part of the land now, the way all memory becomes part of a place over time. He made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the window while it brewed, looking out at the barn. The new strap bracket on the shed door was visible from here, the fresh metal bright against the weathered wood of the frame, and he thought about George refusing payment twice before accepting the eggs, the way he had waved off the second refusal with a single flat gesture that meant the conversation was over. George had driven 45 minutes each way that morning. He had brought his own welding rig on a trailer, set it up without being directed, done the work in 2 hours and refused to discuss cost. Elias had known George for 20 years in the peripheral way of men who live in the same county and share the same service providers, who nod at each other at the co-op and wave from the road. He had not known that George would drive an hour-and-a-half round trip on a Thursday morning with a welding rig to help a man he barely counted as a friend. That knowledge changed the shape of what he understood about the place he lived. The coffee finished, and he poured a cup. He thought about the church, too. Reverend Thomas had stayed past noon, had worked the east fence line with the men from the fire department for 3 solid hours, the good boots muddy to the ankle, his hands on a post driver while his suit jacket hung from a fence post 20 yards away. He had not held a post driver since he was a young man, he had said, and he was relearning it as he went. And he was cheerful about the relearning in the way that people are cheerful about hard physical work when they have chosen it freely. He had led a brief prayer before leaving, standing in the driveway with his muddy boots, his hands loose at his sides. Just a few sentences about the ground and the work and the people who do it, and Elias had found himself genuinely moved in a way he had not been moved in a church setting since Doris's funeral. It was the brevity of it that worked, he thought. The way the prayer did not overstate the moment, just named it and gave thanks for it and returned the people to the work. Nadia, the young woman who had started the phone tree, had worked all morning alongside her cousin Dre and then gone to her shift at Rosie's diner at 11. Still in the work clothes she had arrived in, the hems of her jeans crusted with field mud. Rosie had told him this later, the detail landing with a particular weight. The image of Nadia walking into work, still carrying the morning on her, the mud as a kind of testament. She was 23, Rosie had said. She had never met Elias Cobb before that morning. She had come because Dre had called, and because it seemed like the thing to do. This was what the word community meant when it was working as it was supposed to work. Not sentiment, not obligation, just the plain matter-of-fact response of people who understood that the person in trouble today could be them tomorrow, or could be them next year, or was someone whose grandfather had helped someone else's grandfather in 1968 in a way that no one alive now could trace, but that persisted in the invisible ledger nonetheless. He had thought a great deal in the weeks since the flood about the nature of that ledger, not in the abstract, philosophical way that he might have thought about it before, if he had thought about it at all, but in the specific textured way that a man thinks about a thing when he has felt it in his body, when the truth of it has come to him through the concrete evidence of muddy boots and sump pumps and biscuits on a folding table. The ledger was not about fairness. It was not about matching one act of kindness with another of equal or greater value, the kind of transactional accounting that he had half-consciously performed in his head for most of his adult life. It was something more like memory. The ledger was the accumulated memory of a community of itself, of what it had done and what it was capable of doing, and every act entered into it. Every morning that someone showed up before being asked added to the community's knowledge of its own capacity. He had been depositing into that ledger for decades, in the small ways that he had shown up for people. The hay he had let a neighbour cut when the neighbour's own fields had been lost to drought. The use of his grain auger lent to 3 different families over the years. The times he had helped pull a vehicle from a ditch on County Road 7 without stopping to ask whose vehicle it was. He had not thought of these things as deposits. He had just done them because that was what you did. Now he understood that Doris had known all along what he was doing, and she had been doing the same, and the ledger had been building the whole time. Marcus called on the following Sunday, as he always called. He said the trip had been good for him, that, being back on the land for 2 days, had reminded him of things he needed to remember, though he was vague about what exactly those things were, and Elias did not press him. He said the job in Atlanta was good, the work was good, the city was good, but that he thought sometimes about the farm. Not in a way that made him want to come back necessarily, or not yet, but in a way that felt like unfinished conversation rather than closed chapter. Elias listened to this carefully. He said there would be room here whenever that conversation wanted to continue. He said it without weight, without pressure, without the need he had sometimes felt but usually suppressed, and it landed the way he intended, as an open door rather than an expectation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said he knew, and he thanked him. The sweet potato harvest came in late August, 3 weeks behind his usual schedule, compressed by the late field rehabilitation but abundant in the rows that had come back. Howard's 60% estimate had been conservative. He ended up pulling roughly 72% of a normal yield, which was not a full recovery but was better than he had let himself hope for in the first days after the flood, standing at the edge of the submerged field in the grey morning light. The produce distributor out of Raleigh took the full harvest at standard price and paid within 30 days. The operating loan payment went to the bank in early November as the revised timeline had stipulated, and he was current and the land was his. He stood at the kitchen table on the afternoon he made that payment, the receipt printed from the bank's online portal, sitting on the table in front of him, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he put it in the drawer with the other receipts and farm records. The drawer that had accumulated 31 years of the documented life of this farm, and he closed the drawer and went outside. The fields were stripped clean now, the corn long since harvested and the sweet potato vines disked under, the soil bare and brown and resting for the winter. The cattle were in the south pasture in the thin late autumn sun, and he could see them from the gate, the familiar shapes of them, moving slowly across the grass. He thought about what he would plant in the spring. He thought about Marcus saying, he thought sometimes about the farm. He thought about 22 people and a folding table and strong coffee in a steel thermos. There is a kind of strength that looks like independence, that a man can carry his whole life without ever examining whether it is actually serving him. He had carried that kind of strength for a long time, the conviction that needing help was a sign of something insufficient in himself, that the only honourable position was to solve your own problems on your own ground, with your own hands, and trouble no one else. He had not been wrong about the value of self-reliance, not entirely. The land required it, farming required it. But what May had taught him, what 22 people with shovels had taught him without a single word of instruction, was that self-reliance is not the same as isolation, and that the ability to receive help with grace and gratitude is itself a form of strength, one he had been refusing to practice for years. The ground beneath his boots was his father's ground, and his grandfather's ground, and now his own, and in the spring it would receive the seed again. And the season would turn as it always turned. He was not alone on this land. He had never been alone on this land.